I've been beekeeping for 3 years now. It's my third year. I have 2 hives right now. Typically, I have anywhere between 2 and 5 hives, depending on the year and depending on whether or not I catch a swarm. And so I'll go into that. First of all, this is a beginning beekeeping class. I'm going to go over what it's like to be a beginning beekeeper, and then sort of next steps in terms of what you need to do to learn how to become a beekeeper yourself if you're interested in that kind of thing. So quickly, just what we're going to cover today, just a quick introduction. Again, what we're going to do in terms of just the beginnings, a little history of beekeeping, beekeeping equipment, and then I'm going to walk you through the sort of month by month or season by season duties that a beekeeper, a bee husband requires, a little bit about bee psychology and physiology, and then a tiny bit about advanced beekeeping, and then conclude with some thoughts and things I've learned throughout the years. So first of all, this is not a replacement for bee school. If you want to become a beekeeper and this is something you're interested in, I would highly recommend you go to bee school, because if you don't, you're not going to do very well. Unfortunately, it's a lot of work, and just to learn the information and provided by people who have come before you. And if you're interested in this type of stuff, there is bee school, and now's actually a perfect time to sign up for it. They typically have bee school in between November and February, so that you can start beekeeping for this upcoming year. So history beekeeping. Beekeeping has been around for a ridiculous amount of time. This right here is a photo from 8,000 years ago, seeing somebody actually climbing with stilts and catching bees, or catching honey, while bees try and murder them. Traditionally, for thousands of years, we used little clay pots for our bees, while that was useful, it was extremely unsustainable. So basically, you would spend all winter making these clay pots, creating each individual clay pot and having a hive in it. And then at the end of the season, just smashing the hive and killing all the hives, and then spending your winter building new hives, which just sort of made no sense. So modern beekeeping really began in the 1820s. With something called the LANGSTROTH hive, which is the main type of hive that you'll see. So what makes up a beehive? These are LANGSTROTH hives. So they're traditional hives that you'll see, out and about, and these are by far the most common. So basically what makes up a LANGSTROTH hive is an outer cover, which is a metal outer cover, an inner cover, supers, a queen excluder to prevent the queen from coming here, a deep for the brood and the queen herself, the bottom board, and a stand. So each individual of these deeps, typically you'll have 2 deeps and a number of supers, depending on how much honey you have. But each super is typically 10 frames, and these are what the frames look like. They are sort of pre-built comb, which the bees sort of build out themselves as you go throughout the year. So you can see right here, this is what they build, and they actually, what's called drawing out the comb right here. And again, each is sort of 10 rows long. It's interesting. One of the guy who invented this hive figured out what's called the bee space, and that's about 3/8 of an inch. If you do too much, they'll start building comb. If you do too little space, they'll start building propolis. So they'll start trying to fill in the cracks. So he discovered that if you do a perfect amount, which is about, again, 3/8 of an inch, they won't build comb, they won't build propolis, and you can actually have these individual frames and inspect hives and have hives last throughout the winter, which that's going to be your #1 goal as a intro beekeeper, is surviving the winter. That's the biggest thing, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So this is what the frames look like when they're all built out. As you can see, they've built wax combs. This right here is brood. So that's all the larvae that have turned into brood and are about to hatch. This is what they look like in a 10 frame hive. So again, this is a either a super or a deep. This looks like a super, which is where the honey is. So again, number one is the metal typical top board. Number two is there's an opening right here. Number three is the inside top board, which sort of prevents the bees from completely escaping. Four supers. These are smaller frames and smaller wooden boxes, and that's your honey. That's for you. There's a queen excluder right here, which separates the queen so she can't lay her eggs right here where you want to extract the honey. But then right here are the deeps, and in the northern hemisphere, or the northern part of New England, you do have 2 deeps over the winter. So a typical overwintered hive will have just these 2 deeps, and the supers again are just for you if you get honey. And then there'll be a bottom board, which typically is an open bottom board. So there's a sort of grate, a metal grate that allows access to airflow. And that's a very important thing. You really want airflow, especially in the winter. You might think you want to batten down the hatches, but you actually want airflow so that they can actually regulate the temperature themselves. In the hives themselves, it stays about 100 degrees at all times, and the bees sort of use themselves as insulation, where the queen is sort of right in the center right here, and then they just use themselves as a live insulation, where the hot bees will sort of go out and the colder bees will sort of move in. So they just insulate themselves, and your job is to again make them survive the winter, and that involves not insulation, but airflow, right? Because if they stay wet, just like humans, we can't regulate our body temperature when we're wet, and bees can't do that either. So you really do need airflow. These are some other types of hives. These are more advanced types of hives. This is called a top bar hive, and that's a more natural sort of feeling for the bees. It's just sort of exactly like there's a bunch of frames here. It's almost exactly like the other frame. And that's really used for combed honey. So when you buy the actual honeycomb with the honey, the really expensive honeycomb, you'll get that's typically in a top bar. And then this right here is a flow hive. And the flow hive, while it's very expensive, you actually see the inside of the hive right here. You're not really going to use it that often. This is probably a $2,000 piece of equipment, but it allows extraction just through the hive, which is a really cool idea. These are no more than 10 or 15 years old, really invented in the last 10 or 20 years. And they're really cool pieces of equipment, but they're really expensive and difficult to to really utilize, especially in large scale production. So some of the tools that you'll be typically using, the most important for beginning beekeepers are the suit and the gloves. So as you see there, this is a full veil suit, and that sort of zips up. So everything is sort of copacetic in terms of all zipped up, and you're not going to have any bees that get in. And you have the gloves as well to protect your hands, because they will try and sting you. There are ways of mitigating that, and as you progress, you might want just the veil and the gloves. Some people just wear shorts and a t-shirt with no gloves. They're crazy, but they do it. And it's interesting because bees actually have a ridiculously good sense of smell. So they'll get to know you as a person, right? And they won't sting you typically, and that you can just sort of stand right in the hive or right next to the hive, and they'll just swing by you. And since they know your smell, they'll know who you are. And there are ways of sort of confusing their scent to smell in order to use that to your advantage. So some other tools, This is just called the Hive tool. It looks like a little tiny crowbar, and that's for basically inspecting hives. So you really need to do weekly, bi-weekly inspections on each of the hives, just to see how they're progressing, see how much honey they have, see how much brood they have. This is a bee brush just to brush them off the individual frames. And this is a smoker so that you can actually confuse their sense of smell, just so that when they're when you're inspecting the hive, they can you can smoke them out. They confuse their sense of smell, so they can't communicate as effectively with themselves. And if you do happen to kill a couple, they won't immediately try and murder you as a result of dead bees, because they can actually smell when one of their population dies, and that releases sort of a kill pheromone in their sense of smell, which just goes after the person who kills it. So they really think, you know, a bear's invading, or, you know, what have you, in terms of an invader. These are extractions. These are both manual extractors. So right at the end of the season, you're going to heat up the comb, basically brush off the capped honey, and then put an extractor, and then just spin the crap out of this until honey comes down. And there's a little tube that you just sort of open the gate, and then honey flows. And that's literally just all you have to do to get honey. You don't have to heat it up. You don't have to do anything else. So natural honey is pretty much just uncapped honey that's just been extracted, and maybe filtered a couple times to get rid of all the, you know, the bee parts or the little tiny bits of wax that are still built up. Spring, early spring, that's pretty much when you're going to start your beekeeping. So number one, you're going to set up your equipment, and that involves just putting one bottom board, one deep, and a top board. So you'll see, again, just one deep, which is those bigger frames to begin with. You receive the bees in a large, what's called a package, with a inoculated queen, or a inseminated queen that's already been inseminated. And basically what you do is you grab these packages and flip them upside down and shake the crap out of it until you just put them in the box, and then you just sort of put the queen in there, and then just put it down and leave it for a while. And then what you're going to do for the spring, again, this is sort of April through May. You usually get packages late April, mid-April. And then what you're going to do is just feed them 1-to-1 sugar water solution until you've artificially increased the population of bees. So when what's called the nectar flow comes by, you're going to want to have a huge population, an artificially increased population of bees, so that they can immediately utilize that nectar flow and just start collecting nectar. And I'll show you what that looks like in terms of feeding. So this right here is a package. This is a 2-pound package of bees. So there's about, 3,000, 4,000 bees in each one. Right here where this circle is, where the queen is. This right here is actually just 2-to-1 sugar solution. So it's a little bit of stuff to get them going. Basically what you do is prop these open, take this off, cover it with just a piece of plywood, take the queen out, and then tip it upside down, and then just shake it in the deep. This right here is the queen. So this is a queen. Typically, she will have a couple worker bees with her because the queen actually really can't do anything at all for herself. She's completely useless apart from the fact that she can lay about 10,000 to 20,000 eggs a day. And what you're going to do is basically put this queen, rubber band her inside one of the frames. And if you see right here, there's some sugar fondant. The bees will actually get used to her scent, because again, none of these bees are offspring of the queen. The queen is a brand new queen when you get the package. None of these queens are related to her. They have lived in the hive before, but they're not related to her at all. And their only duty is to propagate the species, the hive there. So over the next couple of days, they'll sort of dig into this, And while they're digging into that, they'll get the pheromones and the scent of the queen, and in the hopes that they'll sort of accept her. And 9.9 times out of 10, they will accept her as long as you've taken the time to put her in the cage. They get a good scent of her smell, and they will eat this sort of sugar fondant and then release her. They don't know they're releasing her at all. They just think they're collecting pollen or nectar, which is exactly their end goal. They open it up and say, "Oh, we got a queen. Oh, this is a great place to live. Let's build a hive," right? So this is a couple ways to feed bees. This is an outer feeder. This is the most common. There's also top feeders. This holds about 3 to 4 gallons, and you just put this right above the deep, and they just sort of use the inside of this. So if you see there's a metal grate right here, they don't actually go inside here. They're just using this metal grate to collect the 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 nectar solution. And the same goes for here. You basically just stick a pint here and then just stick holes in a ball jar. And excuse me, that's exactly, you just put it right there and then they'll just suck up the nectar. Right now, my bees are being fed via both these ways. So I would say they go through about a gallon of water nectar a day, which seems like a lot, but it actually takes a lot of energy to, create both pollen or both drawn out frames as well as honey. So it takes about 10 times as much energy to draw out the frames as it does to just put the pollen in there and make the honey. So, as a beginning beekeeper, you really want either drawn out frames or just feeding them again 1-to-1 so that they can just artificially draw out each individual comb where you see right here, these are drawn out combs. So this is what a hive, this is what a deep frame will look like. And I would say this is a fantastic representation of a brood pattern. So if you see this right here, these are all brood that are going to hatch in the next 2 or 3 days. Again, the queen probably lays 10 to 20,000 eggs a day. In theory, you're having 5,000 to 7,000 bees that are being released per day. So as you can see right here, it looks like these brood left the hive a little early, and then all these brood are about to emerge. This is a great look to the hive. You want them slightly popped out, but you don't want them too popped out. As you can see right here, there are some that are slightly more popped out and or bigger. Those are drones, which are the male bees. And honestly, male bees are good for nothing at all in the hive. In theory, if you had 0 males in the entire hive, they would flourish just fine. Male bees, which are called drones, are really only good for sex, right? So the queen will go and leave one time if she's not been inseminated artificially to do a mating flight. And then the drones will, propagate with her, and then she'll just fly back in the hive, and she'll never see a drone ever again, or she'll never deal with a drone ever again. And the drones don't do anything except waste space. So really, at the end of the fall, they just kick out all the drones, and all of these are females that do basically all the work in terms of getting honey, feeding. As you can see, these right here, these are the larvae right here, these little tiny things, and feeding larvae, feeding the queen, making sure she's clean and healthy, and all the tasks are done by the females. So going into summer, checking on bees, again, that involves weekly or bi-weekly inspections, which are very important. You really want to check your hives at least bi-weekly to make sure that the hive is doing well, that you have a good population of female worker bees, and you want to find your queen at least once a month. It may be intimidating and tough to find the queen. But if you have evidence, again, if you have evidence of queen being here, which like a larvae or eggs, there's no eggs in this particular frame. But if you see eggs, that means the queen is at least alive in the next, has been there in the last 2 or 3 days. So that's really what you're looking for. A huge part of beekeeping is mite control. Specifically, there's something called varroa mites, which are a sort of invasive mite species from Asia. And really as a result of globalization, we have all of these mites that these bees are not used to at all. Typically, you're going to be doing European honeybees. There's also Russian honeybees. There's also African honeybees. So you can buy individual honeybees, but mite control is a very, very important thing. And I could talk for hours about mite control. Personally, I use something called an oxalic acid vaporizer, which is a pretty expensive vaporization tool that just sort of sticks on the bottom of a hive. But there's also Formic Pro, which is just like a strip of formic acid, or Apivare, which is another sort of strip of mite control. And then harvesting may or may not. Again, your end goal at the, as a first-time beekeeper is to have your bees survive the winter. That's really, if your bees have survived the winter, and even if they make it to January, February of the first year, you're doing a good job. And, you should be proud of yourself, because there is this sort of, gustav that you get, where you get the package, your bees are thriving throughout the winter or fall, summer and fall, and then they just sort of crash, and you feel bad because your bees have died. And the bees really don't think of themselves as individuals, so it's impossible to do an autopsy on a hive. If you open a hive that's dead, there's just not going to be any bees in it. And you're going to say, well, I don't know what happened. It very well may have been mites. And that's, a big part of beekeeping is mite control. Interestingly enough, there's another way of keeping mites at bay. And that's just to have a different size frame. So as you can see, all of these are exactly the same size. And those are perfectly the right size for female bees. But like I showed you, the males are slightly bigger. So what you can do is you can buy a male frame, and the queen and the honeybees, or the worker bees themselves, will know to dig these frames out slightly bigger. And then the queen will only lay males in that particular frame. And what you do, because the mites like a larger frame and a larger surface area, you just take the frame, stick it in the freezer, and kill all the males, and then just put the frames back in. And the worker bees will take out the dead males, and then just do it again. And that's a great way of mite control if you don't want to use chemicals, which sometimes people may or may not want to use the chemicals depending on the season and depending on what time of year you're doing this mite control. So a couple things that could go wrong. This is a swarm of bees. Swarm is sort of a misnomer. This basically means that there is too much or not enough real estate for the bees, and the queen feels like she can just leave the hive as it is. She'll lay a couple queen cells, and then those queen cells will become queens. And then they'll just sort of fight over control until there's one queen. And as soon as that happens, the queen will just leave with half her population and find a new home. So really that biweekly or weekly check is very important to make sure that you don't have too many bees all stuffed in one frame or the one hive, because they will swarm. And this year actually was a really bad year for swarms. A lot of bees did swarm. But as a beekeeper, you can actually take advantage of that. So this is actually me and a friend taking a swarm, or taking a pre-existing hive that has actually lived in this tree that actually fell down. That was a couple of years back during that really bad storm. And this is actually me putting all the bees in a makeshift deep. This is 2 supers, but it's a makeshift deep, and taking a swarm or taking a hive and putting it in there and using that and just leaving with a bunch of bees and hopefully the queen. That's in the most important part is you have the queen inside this hive. But basically what I did for this inspection or this cutout is I chainsawed this tree open, took all of the bees resources, whether that be combed out brood or combed out honey, and then just put everything I could possibly in this hive, left it overnight, and then just left with the hive itself. And I was actually thankfully able to have this hive thriving. And this is one of the 2 hives that survived over the last winter for me. The other hive did not make it, unfortunately. And I do believe that it's because of the varroa mites. That's my speculation. But again, there's no real way to do an autopsy on a hive. And that comes with the sort of nature of the business that if you're not willing to do mite control, you're going to lose a lot of bees. And again, bee school comes in really, really big handy in terms of that kind of stuff. If you want to learn how to effectively control mites. These are some bees entering the hives. So I took this photo. This is again, the side feeder. As you can see, they're bringing in pollen. And so what they do is, if you've ever seen honeybees collecting pollen, they collect it on their back legs, and then they just sort of buff themselves up and bring the pollen in, bring it in there and in the hive and put it in, the combed out places. And then that's really what they'll do. And they'll make probably 18 hours a day, just going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, collecting pollen and bringing it back to the hive. Again, they really have a hive mind. So really all that matters to you and the hive itself is, number 1, the queen, and number 2, the population of bees that you have. So the population as a whole, how that population is progressing and how many, like physically how many bees you have. So the weekly and biweekly inspections are very important in that aspect. So fall, which is really what we're in now, we really started fall at the beginning of the last month. So beginning of September is when I did my last inspection, took out my supers, got any honey, which actually I didn't get honey this year. It wasn't a great year for nectar. We call it the nectar flow, and the nectar flow is extremely hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. It involves 100,000 different factors, whether that's rain flow, amount of flowers blooming, the flowers in your area, and just a number of factors that we just have no idea exactly what the nectar flow is going to be like until we find the nectar flow. And so when the nectar is flowing, it's really good, but there is periods of time called dearth, which it's sort of in between fall and summer, or in between spring and summer, where the the spring flowers have either died or are not producing any pollen, but the summer flowers have not started to produce pollen. So there is those couple periods of time that you're always going to get that you might need to feed them, and the inspections really will tell you whether or not you have a good population, your population strong and healthy and thriving. Again, your biggest thing is mite control and getting ready for winter. So what I'm doing right now is I'm actually just using my oxalic acid vaporizers to pump a bunch of oxalic acid into the hives themselves, and that'll kill all the mites in theory. And then I actually inspect each individual frame, and I have a little tool that'll tell me how many mites per sort of square inch I have in a given hive. And if I feel like there's not enough oxalic acid or too many mites, then I might increase the oxalic acid, or you might use, again, formic acid or apivar, which is more sort of chemicals to produce hive. There is a growing movement called natural beekeeping, you're welcome to do that, and that's just sort of letting the bees fight it out themselves. But just be prepared to lose a lot of hives because unfortunately, because we have such a globalized economy and globalized ecosystem, there will be a lot of hives that just die. So again, I talked a little bit about harvesting. You could get a lot of honey your first couple of years. So my second year, each hive produced about 75 pounds of honey per hive. Some actually produce about 100 pounds of honey per hive, and that's a ridiculous amount of honey. It's a fairly expensive hobby, but you can actually make your money back in theory after a couple of years of learning it. The more honey you get, the more profit you get. I sell my honey for about $10 to $12 a pound. So 100 pounds, that's about $1,000. That's pretty much recapping how much I spent on each individual hive. And then getting ready for winter. So that's feeding the hives, getting all the supers down. And I'm going to do 1 or 2 last inspections to make sure I have a good proportion of fake nectar, which is 2-to-1 sugar water. So that's what I'm doing now is just feeding them. And again, they go through like a gallon of sugar water per day, which is kind of a ridiculous amount of fluid and something you wouldn't expect out of 40,000 or 30,000 tiny little insects. So winter, battening down the hatches. So there are mice guards, there are just sort of little wooden entrance reducers to keep mice, any other intruders or invaders, whether that be fellow hives that are preying on the weaker hives. That will very often happen where a strong hive will rob the honey or nectar out of a weaker hive. So there's all sorts of problems with invasion. There's also a lot of people have electric fences because of bears. So that's a very common thing, especially here. You will get bears in your yard, and they'll just knock down the hive and just do whatever they feel like and destroy your hive and kill all your hive and steal whatever honey they have in the process. So again, I talked a little bit about ventilation. That's actually a really important thing. Some people actually cut holes in the top of the hives so there is just a huge amount of airflow. The bees themselves, again, they'll keep the hive about 100 degrees at all times. So it's interesting that the queen is in the very center of this. But if they get wet, then they can't regulate their temperature and they can't use themselves as insulation. And then feeding. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go buy 100 pounds of honey, sugar, and then just make them into pollen patties. So that's just sort of like a certain amount of sugar to a certain amount of water. And then I'll just put like a 4-pound, 5-pound pollen patty on top of the hive, and then just peek in there every couple of weeks to make sure that they are still using the pollen. I'm never going to really go inside the hives during the winter because it really could, the harsh temperatures could be, really bad for the bees. So that's sort of November through April. A little bit about bee psychology and physiology. So the 3 types of typical honeybee, these are all European honeybees. So these are the worker bees. These are females, all females. This is the queen. If you see her little, I forget exactly what you call it, but both of these can sting. Worker bees can only really sting 1 or 2 times before they lose their stinger. In theory, a worker bee can become a queen bee at any point. It just depends on how the workers are feeding the larvae. So if they feed what's called royal jelly to a larvae, it will become a queen. These are drones. Again, these are all males. Interestingly enough, a female can determine each individual egg that she produces, whether or not it will be a male or a female. And the way she does that is if an egg is inseminated with sperm, it will become a female. If it's not inseminated, it will become a male. So she can choose each individual one. That results in her choosing probably close to 99% females to males. And that's very important. If you have a queen that's not laying as many workers as you'd like, there are ways of fixing that. And typically that involves finding the queen, killing her, and getting a new queen. It may sound a little brutal, but that's really the way to do it. If the hive itself, if the worker bees don't feel like the queen is producing well enough, they'll just murder her on her own. And you don't want that. That's a recipe for disaster, because they'll make, right here, queen cells right here. So these are queen cells. These are all queens ready to hatch. And that slows you down for potentially months, because the queens need to hatch, kill all the other queens, and then get inseminated themselves naturally. And that may or may not happen. Some people just choose to let a hive be, and that's totally fine. But you may expect just no queen, and the hive to either just die, or you have to combine the hive with a stronger hive. This right here is an interesting frame. This is a queen, a marked queen. So typically you're going to want to buy a marked queen so that you can see the queen from the many thousands of bees. This is a painted on. A beekeeper has physically put a little dot of paint on this queen right here. And as you can see, the worker bees are sort of surrounding her and doing all of her tasks. Her only task is to lay eggs. They feed her, they clean her, they bathe her, they do everything they can. And that's sort of how to find the queen, is to look for this circle of worker bees around the queen. So a little bit quickly about advanced beekeeping. Requeening, I talked a little bit about that. Requeening is a sad but really important need for the hive, especially if the hive isn't producing as much honey as you want. If it's laying too many males, there's a number of factors that can result in the answer just to be a requeen hive. And then swarms, I talked a little bit about that. Just really give them enough real estate to produce, and give them extra real estate. So that's adding supers when you see that there's a lot of bees and there's a lot of capped honey specifically. And then there's all sorts of queen rearing, swarm catching, all sorts of stuff that go into large scale production that could be, an entire 20-hour course on its own. So really to conclude, number one, my biggest takeaway, if you take away nothing from this and you're still interested in this, go to bee school. It's about $100, and it will save you a lot of money, a lot of stress. And personally, I learned a ton from just bee school. Number two, do your research. Don't just go to bee school, read books about beekeeping, join Facebook groups about beekeeping, talk to fellow beekeepers, find a mentor that'll teach you this kind of stuff, because there is a little bit of sort of Zen involved in beekeeping. It's pretty daunting when you're in a full suit, you're sweating your butt off, and there's 100,000 bees all trying to kill you all at once. It's pretty exhausting and tiring. But when you're doing the inspections, there is a Zen that you sort of slowly do things, and you do everything very, very slowly. You take each individual frame very slowly, look at it, individual frames, scrape off all the bees, and then move on to the next frame, open the supers, move on to the next super. And it's just sort of like a Zen thing. And again, really don't give up. That's a big thing. Again, there is the sort of plateau you reach when you're a first-time beekeeper, especially your first year, where you have a great summer, your bees are thriving, they're bearding very well, which means they're sort of leaving the hive, like not leaving the hive, but putting themselves out of the hive. They have a huge population of bees. And then when fall or winter comes and they just all die, and you don't know what happened, and you just get really sad. Personally, I get really stressed out about my beehives I think about my bees probably 10 to 20 times a day. And it is a source of anxiety for me, but it is, again, a source of sort of zen for me. I wake up, look at my bees in the summer, drink my cup of coffee and just watch them go in and out while they're collecting, nectar, watch them make their, the new bees make their first flight, which is really, really satisfying thing to do. So lastly, these are some links to the bee schools. Personally, I did something called Stonewall Apiaries, which is run by a guy named Stuart. There's also the Eastern Connecticut Beekeepers Association and the Connecticut Beekeepers Association as well, that will provide you knowledge, as well as provide you, with possibly a mentor if that's something you want, or even your local beekeeper. You may be surprised at how many beekeepers you actually have in your surrounding area. Anytime you see a honeybee that's collecting honey, that's typically going to be an owned honeybee, and that means there is someone that keeps bees in your area within a 4 or 5 mile radius. So yeah, generally that's really my suggestion, is to do a lot of research. You're looking at spending probably $1,000 total, maybe a little more, because you really do want 2 hives. You don't really want to buy 1 hive, because you won't have anything to compare it to, right? You can see a hive that's just a single hive, and you won't know whether or not it's a strong hive or not, and you really want something to compare it to. So you're really going to want to buy 2 hives. And then the weekly or biweekly checks, that's maybe an hour or 2 per week in the summer. And in the winter, it's really almost no work at all. You just sort of throw the pollen on, the patty on, and that's really it. So really, yeah, that's really, all I have to talk about. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, I'm going to be, we're going to be sending the links to these bee schools, which usually start early January, and you can get your bees directly from there, get all the equipment directly from all of these beekeeper association. They typically get their bees from Georgia, or they rear them themselves. And then you'll be able to get a package starting in April. So yeah, that's really all I have for today.
Well, thank you, Evan. So now I think we're going to open it up for question and answer. So if you have a question, you can either unmute yourself and ask the question, or if you want to put it in the chat, you're more than welcome. Ada is getting us right into it and is asking, what prompted your interest in beekeeping?
I don't really know. I was just like scrolling through like a video game stream, and somebody was like, hey, do you keep bees, to this guy who streams video games? He's like, no, I don't keep bees. And I'm like, hey, that sounds really interesting. So my neighbor actually keeps bees. And I actually got to go through a whole season with him and learn a little bit about what that's like to become a beekeeper and be put right in that environment to, learn what it's like to be a beekeeper and not have a panic attack when you're wearing a full bee suit and it's 100 degrees out and you're sweating and there's 1,000 bees everywhere and there's just buzzing so it's a little bit intimidating, but again, there is sort of like a zen to it that you'll learn to love your bees, and you'll learn to love beekeeping as in general.
Tanya is wondering, she says, seems like everyone is treating their lawns with chemicals in town. And so is it still possible to successfully keep a hive?
Absolutely. In terms of chemicals, unless there's like a large scale, like I don't know, like Monsanto is like spraying chemicals in like a huge like area of, say, corn or, some sort of other crop. Smaller scale, like Roundup and all that kind of stuff doesn't really affect the bees as a whole. It doesn't really do anything. they'll learn to avoid that kind of stuff, and they'll actually learn and smell the pesticides on each individual crop, and learn that no, we shouldn't associate ourselves with this because it has, you know, negative implications. So they'll actually learn that themselves most of the time.
Obviously, you wouldn't want to be using it in your yard, right?
I mean, I do spray for yellow jackets if I see a hive of yellow jackets, but I won't like use, you know, chem lawn or any of that kind of stuff on my lawn. Bees are really looking for huge expanses of land that have like large scale crops. So like if you live close to a cornfield, if you live close to a huge, you know, expanse of wildflowers, that's perfect, you know, for bees. You can, you know, you can humor yourself by planting a lot of crops for bees, but at the end of the day, they're not really going to care about your tiny garden unless you have acres and acres and acres and acres of, you know, wildflowers, which if you do, you know, all the more power to you. And, you know, I get satisfaction out of planting flowers, especially during the fall, and seeing my bees feeding off the plants that I planted for them. So I do get satisfaction out of it, but it's probably to no avail, let's say.
So Patrick's wondering if he were to find a bee that doesn't seem to be doing well, is it possible to help them?
The only thing you really can do is if a bee's stuck inside somewhere, you can free it. If a bee is not doing so well, they will just altruistically commit suicide. So that's the reason why they just sort of leave the hive, and there's no real way of like doing an autopsy on a hive. When you open a hive that's dead, you're not going to see a bunch of dead bees on the ground because they've actually just left the hive so that they can save the other bees' energy so that they don't have to drag dead bodies out of the hive. There's really no good in saving an individual bee. But on that note, I feel like for a long time, I really did care about the longevity of each individual bee. And as a result, I feel like I was a worse beekeeper, and I did kill more bees as a result of that. So now I do care a little bit less about each individual bee. But as a result, I understand the population as a whole. I understand, you know, I can't save each individual bee. And if there's a couple bees, which inevitably there will be bees that you kill every single time you open the hive. So that's why you don't want to do it too much. But really, really, again, the two things you care about are number one, the queen. The queen actually lives a ridiculous amount of time. She can live like 4 to 5 years. But a regular honeybee in the summer only lives like 30 to 45 days. So a really, really short amount of time because they're spending, again, 18 hours a day, 19 hours a day. Anytime it's daylight, they're just going back and forth and back and forth. And if they're not doing so well, if they feel like they're dying, if they're older, they'll just leave and just never be seen again and then just die somewhere else. It's unfortunate to think that way, but we're not really a hive mind species, right? Like we can learn a lot about from, you know, that kind of stuff from bees, but they're just completely foreign to us. We do not think that way. We're individualized creatures, right? Whereas bees are hive-minded creatures, just like ants, just like all those kind of, you know, insects and stuff like that.
So this is actually a question from me. So you talked about how hives can kind of like overgrow or outgrow their homes, and you said you can add supers. But is it possible for you to split a hive and to prevent it from swarming?
Yes. So you can split hives. That's a little bit more difficult. But basically, it's sort of the same process as buying a new colony of bees. All you need to do is split the hive, make sure there's one queen in one, and then with the other hive, what you're going to do is you buy a queen that's been inseminated, or a queen that you've reared yourself, which is super advanced, and split the hive into 2 hives. The other thing you can do is if you have 2 very weak hives, you can combine the hives for the winter. So that's usually what I do. At the end of the summer, if there's a very weak hive, and or the queen has died, I'm not gonna, all the bees are not for loss. You can combine the hives, and that just sort of involves getting all of those old bees reintroduced to the pheromone smell of the new queen. You basically separate it with a little bit of newspaper, and then just keep it like that for a couple days, and then just slowly they'll rip apart the newspaper, and they will sort of acclimate themselves to this new hive, because in a hive they don't really understand that they are in like a kept hive. They're just like, oh, look at all this space. Oh, look at all this honey. Oh, look at all this brood. This is a great place for a hive. Let's build a hive. They're really thinking that it is a wild environment, and when it's an artificially produced environment that you're creating and curating yourself. So there is combination as well as splitting as well. That's definitely two things that are a little bit more advanced, but definitely stuff that is useful.
Any other questions? I have another from Ada. How do you prevent the bees from getting angry when working with the hive? I know you mentioned, going slowly and being zen.
Yeah, so going slowly, smoking them out. So I showed you a picture. Let me quickly see if I can go back. It's basically just it's a smoker, so that it will, right here, it will, there's some leaves and sticks and stuff. You're basically starting a little tiny fire with some bellows, and this will confuse them. It'll make them unable to communicate with themselves effectively. And also, if you do get stung, they will release a kill pheromone in that stinger that says, all the bees who smell this pheromone, which they can smell it really well, murder this person, go after this person. And you can, so when you get stung by a bee, you'll get stung 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 times, all in the same sort of exact area. And the smoker prevents that. And then also, if they know you as a person, like if they know your scent, there's a lot of beekeepers who don't even wear any sort of protective gear because their bees have been with them for years and years and years. So they know their scent. They open their hives, they can stick their hand in and pick up the bees, pick up the queen, do whatever they want. And they just do it without a veil, without anything else. You will get stung. You will get stung.
I was going to ask, how many times have you been stung?
Hundreds.
Wow.
But typically that's if I'm acting stupid, that most of the time when I'm acting stupid, I have a swarm. Swarms are very harmless unless they've, like I showed you, connected themselves to an actual colony right here, which this is an actual colony. And I was dumb enough to just come in sort of naked and expect them to act like my bees. And they're not going to act like my bees because they don't know my scent. They don't know what I'm doing. I'm chainsawing their entire hive opening there, so I really had to put on the suit. I got stung probably 20 times that day. But really this year, I think I got stung twice, maybe 2 times. And they can sting hard. They can sting to kill, or to kill themselves, and they can also just sort of tap you, and they can lightly sting. So they can actually choose how hard they want to sting, and that's based on whether or not they feel the colony is being threatened, or if their life is in danger. They will sting to kill, but if they feel like they're just warning you, they might just give you a little tap, and it might swell up a little bit. It'll hurt a little bit, but apart from that, you really should be fine, unless you're like super allergic or anything. You do. So
if you're allergic to bees, not a good pastime for you.
What was that?
If you're allergic to bees, this is not the pastime for you.
Yeah, and you do actually become a little more allergic to bees as you get stung more and more. But then it reaches a certain threshold where you actually become less, reactive to the stings. So you gain reactivity, and then you actually lose reactivity after you've been stung a certain amount of times. And again, it's really, really rare that my bees will sting me. They'll sting me occasionally if I'm an idiot and I'm coming out with no veil and no gloves and opening up a hive that has not enough real estate and are very angry. And you can hear the buzz that's coming out of, it'll be louder than the normal inspection buzz, and you can tell that they're kind of pissed at you and not happy. But you really, again, this year I probably got stung lightly 2 times the whole year. So I was lucky this year, but I've been stupid.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Evan. Last call for questions. Feel free. All right, seeing and hearing none. Thank you so much, Evan, for sharing your experiences with us and your wisdom. We will be sending a follow-up email with the links to the bee schools and other information, so keep an eye out for that. If you want to watch this again or share it with friends, it will be on our YouTube channel. And I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
And have a great evening. Thank you.
All right.